So we're going to go ahead with our next session. Thank you. So you might be asking yourself where the idea for this session came from. And it's a couple years old. When we were going to have the last technical conference before the great Rona, we thought one of the things that we wanted to pursue was an in-depth discussion about our regional identity, but we wanted to bring someone else in from a different region to help us to frame the discussion. And so we put together a panel for you today to really have a moment of introspection, to look at ourselves honestly, to determine whether or not we think our narrative is correct, and also to see if we can come to a common language around our identity. When you talk about identity, basically what you're considering is, what's your story? Is someone else telling it for you? Someone else framing the narrative for you? Or are you framing it for yourselves as a community? And that's something that we've all been talking about for our signature grape, Pinot Noir. Who is it? Who is our Pinot Noir? What is it? What is its stamp, right? And so what we decided to do in order to put together these 7 wines in front of you is that we sent out a regional call to everyone in the valley and said, we're going to do a blind tasting. And we would like to have you participate. And all of you are welcome to come, taste through all the wines, and we're going to vote to see which wines we think are the most typical of Anderson Valley Pinot Noir. And so the 7 wines in front of you are the result of that tasting. That tasting was held about 6 weeks ago. And the winemakers and wine growers that got together to taste those wines all voted blind to see which ones we thought should be shown to you. These are them. And through the process of talking with this outstanding panel in front of you, we are going to whittle them down even further. So this is a 2-part tasting, and this is the first part of the tasting. I wanted to introduce all these guys because they're all heroes of mine, but they want to introduce themselves. So I'm going to hand the mic over to them, but I would just like to say that it is a great pleasure to have all 3 of these men up on the dais, and we're going to learn a lot today. So I'm going to hand it over to Mr. Frost.
Thank you, Gil. So my name is Doug Frost. While I live in Kansas City, I actually have a winery project in Walla Walla, Washington, and we do not make Pinot Noir. As I was admitting to David yesterday, it's because I'm a coward, okay? We do Syrah, Bordeaux varieties, let her rip, man, but Pinot Noir.
That's really cheap. I mean, you've got to come up with a better answer.
It's the truth. Anyway, also it doesn't grow very well there. But nonetheless, just wanted to say that I'm very delighted to be hanging out with these 2 guys because I do feel that I'm sort of a typical, unfortunately typical wine drinker in so much as I love Pinot Noir. It's actually the first wine I ever had in my life was 1968 Louis Martini Special Select Pinot Noir, and I still remember the damn thing. It set me going. Let's say it. Let's put it that way. But what I know about Anderson Valley is pretty dismal. Other than the fact that I drink them a lot, and because other people make them, and so I think we hope we'll have an opportunity to talk about that. David? You are David.
I am. And I was asked earlier today, when was the last time I was in Anderson Valley? Never. So I'm an expert. It's actually part of what we're going to be talking about. Why haven't I been here? Well, it's way far away from everything, for one. Two, until I read on the Anderson Valley Winegrowers Association website this morning that 59% of the grapes planted are Pinot, I didn't know that. And we can go on from there, but I'm happy to be here finally, and way too late.
David Adelsheim, Adelsheim Winery.
Wait, he left out that he's one of the most famous winemakers in Oregon and a pillar of the Oregon Appellation Identity Project for decades, and a hell of a guy. Okay, just... So I'm batting for the home team today. I've lived in the Appellation for 20 years. I started covering it for the Wine Press in 1992, I believe. Wrote for all the major magazines, wrote a bunch of books. But one of the greatest things I've seen in my career in wine is watching this appellation find itself and become truly a world-class Pinot Noir winemaking region. And a lot of people in this room that I count as friends and inspirations. And so my role mostly is going to be to remind some of us of our patchy history and what a great road we have in front of us.
Thank you, Thom. So we will indeed be going through these sort of broad categories. Certainly to talk about the why of it all is sort of where we'll start. And then the how the hell you do it and how it has impact. And then this is one of the outcomes that we hope, but we don't know, we'll get from this. Will we decide there is such a thing as an identifiable, describable, marketable identity for these wines? And we hope that'll come, if it comes honestly, out of the wines that are in front of you. So on your sheets, you know, there's a little session 3 page there that has extremely detailed grid for extremely detailed notes. You have your aromas, flavors, acidity, body, tannin, meh, that's it. Okay, so that's your job. And in fact, what I would like to do is again kind of go down the table here before we get into the slides themselves to say we're asking you to pick 4 wines, but we're asking you not necessarily to pick your 4 favorites. It is instead, what do you think the 4 wines are in front of you that might best represent a continued discussion about whether or not there are certain characteristics that describe an identity for Anderson Valley Pinot Noir. David, would you improve on that? Because I'm sure you can.
Only to the extent that this is not a normal tasting. I know you're human beings. I'm guessing that's true.
We did check for that.
Yes, that was part of the application process, yes.
They're vaccinated too.
And human beings want to pick what they like the best. If you're given 7 things, the first thing you're going to do is decide which one is your favorite. That is useless to us. What we want you to do, instead of picking your favorite or picking the worst wine on the table, we want you to figure out which ones best express what you think is the Anderson Valley style of red Pinot Noir still wine. Is that clear?
That is very clear. But Thom can improve upon that too.
So if you're not familiar with Anderson Valley Pinot Noir already, if you're from out of region, or you trade or press, another way to approach this is to say, as Gil explained, the appellation itself came up with these 7 wines as representative signature style for the appellation. Can you find that and help them finish that process and get it down to 4?
Right. So in doing what you'll be utilizing is obviously your own palate. Make some notes because we're going to try to get some feedback from you as to when and why. What particularly is distinctive about it, sir.
There's one other thing.
Oh, please.
When you try a wine, it's a combination of two things. It's what the human being provided and what the place provided. We don't give a damn about the human beings. Well, you are the exception, but I mean, in this tasting, we don't care how much new wood has been used, how much whole cluster's been used, how long it was in barrel, if they made acid additions, if the acid's too high or too low. But we're concerned about what's in the nose. We're concerned about how the wine feels in your mouth. And anything else that you think is typical for Anderson Valley Pinot. So you've got to act like a winemaker and distinguish the things that are there because of where the grapes are grown, as opposed to what the human being did. Sorry to interrupt.
No, that's perfect. So you'll be doing that, and in fact, you'll be doing that now. You'll get a chance to vote. You'll actually rank them, and you'll see a QR code on your placemat. You'll, stick your phone over that and treat it like any other QR code. If it goes to a site that's called Skin Contact and has lots of naked bodies, you're on the wrong site. Back out, do it again. Don't be a member of parliament. Ex-member of parliament, sorry. Anyway, so what we're up to really is talking about, in the meanwhile, while you're doing the hard work and making some notes and everything, is trying to suss out the why of it and certainly the what of it. So if it's okay, I thought I'd turn the floor over to Thom to talk about this slide. Just seems like you might have spent some time musing over the idea of an appellation at some point in your life.
So I had a 3-year project to cover all the appellations in California for Wine Country Living, and that meant systematic tastings, visiting the appellations, talking to their marketing managers, asking them what their story was, what their identity was, what their signature was. And it became apparent really quickly that some appellations had that dialed in. And every vintner you would talk to was on script. And other appellations, they thought that was the most interesting question, and what did I think? So, and then Appellation America had the project to map every appellation systematically in North America, and I was assigned to Mendocino County, Anderson Valley, Sonoma, other parts of the North Coast. So that was more systematic tasting, systematic studying, and looking at what appellation identity is. And so these 4 slides kind of sum it up. The first thing is that it's stable. The story doesn't change. You can probably, think of appellations where the story's been the same forever. Napa Valley is one. And it's based on a combination of the wine quality itself. In other words, if there isn't a lot of really good wine for people to taste and recognize, you don't get very far. But then there has to be some regional set of factors that go with the wine and make that wine identity real for people. They can see it, they can place it. Everyone here, I'm sure, you could close your eyes and see Napa Valley or see Russian River Valley in your mind. You need that. This identity has to be memorable for human beings, not just wine writers. It has to be something that anyone can communicate to trade and consumers, and their eyes light up, and they're happy to have that. They get it. And finally, it has to make money for the people on the ground. If it's not actually creating equity in the appellation that puts a higher floor under your vineyard and your wine, then what's it good for? And David's going to talk about that in more detail because he's done this for decades for his entire massive application. But that's the bottom line. It has to create appellation equity from that identity. And this is something that Anderson Valley has struggled with for a long time, and that's why we're talking about it here today.
And that's why we brought in David Adelsheim, other than, just because you're super sexy. And, well, he is. Somebody who went, oh, come on now. Don't judge like that. But it is the tremendous experience you've had I'm sure much of it painful.
This is really embarrassing, actually.
Sorry about that. And you expected nothing less, I'm sure. So,
Welcome to Anderson Valley, David.
So that's my slide. Oh, you mean I can cheat? Yes, thank you. I mean, to some extent, Anderson Valley and the Willamette Valley were sort of started at the same time. Mid-60s, early plantings, 70s, a few more, 80s kind of starting to get their feet under them. One of the things that in the back of my mind continues to exemplify Anderson Valley is that a lot of the early people, and perhaps some today, were coming this far away from, say, San Francisco because they wanted to be far away from San Francisco, or people, or the bother that people bring. And that's good to some extent, but it's the antithesis of building an Appalachian identity, because Appalachian identity requires collaboration. And if you can collaborate, then you do get these things like higher grape prices and higher wine prices and more press attention and stronger media coverage, social, mass, etc. And ultimately, what some people here may fear, which is more tourists. Because in fact, many of the wineries in Anderson Valley are fundamentally D2C wineries. That means they need people visiting the winery to make money. And I think that's part of today's wine industry, regardless of where you are. D2C is a very important component, and COVID only made that more important. So it's a great thing, but it's also a very selfish thing. Because when you sell wine D2C, you're only selling your wine. You're not selling Anderson Valley, you're not selling California or America, you're just selling your wine. So going back to Appalachian identity, it requires the mental acrobatics to get above your brand and to find common cause with others within Anderson Valley, and to understand what is best for the whole valley as opposed to just your brand. I think that's what I'm stopping with.
I think that's a good place to stop and ponder. Again, your role, should you decide to accept it, is to continue to taste and judge and rank and get to that QR code and start plugging in those scores, because Gil will collect them, we'll pick 4, and then you can guess what will happen after that. There'll be more tasting. Meanwhile, it's entirely possible that some things that we taste might be, I don't know, from maybe another region or so. We certainly, as we had this discussion, we asked ourselves, who owns what one would regard as a effective Appalachian identity when it comes to Pinot Noir? You know, we obviously think Willamette does because David's here. The Russian River Valley, yeah, okay, I'll go with that. Santa Lucia Highlands, yep, sure. Who are we missing? Santa Rita, yep, no question. What was it? Monterey, okay. Santa Lucia Highlands, isn't that like the sweet spot there? But yeah, I get you, for sure. Anybody else? Caneros, yeah, I know. We couldn't drink everything, although we tried. Trust us, during the testing cycle, we drank everything. And you got to compare it to Grand Cru Burgundy, right? Otherwise, how do you know? Thank you for your contribution. Sorry, what else? Sonoma Coast. The real Sonoma Coast, or yeah, sorry, just gonna always have to ask that question, just so people go, oh my God. But it brings us to, if you will, that conversation about what is an appellation and how are we going to define it.
Right. The ability to name them does not give them an identity that raises the floor for all producers. That's a distinction that we want to make here today. Just the fact that you can name them doesn't mean that they're earning for you.
If I could, once again while you're tasting, I'd sort of throw this slide at the two of you because I think both of you had really cogent concepts that you were applying to some of these questions. Clearly, the Willamette has been identified with a single grape, though Chardonnay is better than ever. Pinot Gris, certainly people have tried to make it more of a focus. David, is the focus on one grape variety an absolute necessity, or merely, is it one of the legs on the stool, or is it, if it's there, it's easier?
I mean, there are a number of things up there. Are they individually necessities? Maybe not. But clearly, the more you pick one of those, the more of those that you can check off, the better the chance of successfully getting public attention, and that your appellation would make sense. So I drew up, I think, a fair number of these, thinking that in a certain sense, this is what helped define the Willamette Valley and its sub-AVAs, the focus on one grape variety, Pinot Noir. But I think equally important, focus on making great wine. And that, in the beginning, it was ridiculously naive thought that you could make great wine in a place with no history that anybody knew of, and that this group of originally 10 people, only one of whom had ever made wine before, only one of whom had ever grown grapes before, could somehow make great wine. But I think the idea that great wine was the ticket of admission to having a place that would be recognized was fundamental. And the key to making that happen was collaboration. Partly this was because in the beginning, the 10 families, and even as others were added on, we were all broke. We had no money. We couldn't afford to do research individually. We couldn't do marketing on our own. To do anything of any value, we had to work with our neighbors. So being broke, in fact, was a help in some respects. But whether everybody is broke or not, it's pretty clear that collaboration is instrumental in having an identity for an AVA. Because if you can't talk and show your wines to everybody within the AVA and have a conversation, in essence, that moves everyone toward a similarity of some kind, then it's just a random selection of wines, and it isn't a style of wine.
So I'm going to take this next one because I've watched it up close for a long time, and that's the issue of controlling the narrative. Anderson Valley, for a long time, all the wine that was made here was made by local producers, and Anderson Valley was unusual because for most of Mendocino County, 2/3 of the fruit left the county in trucks, anonymously went to Sonoma and Napa, where appellation labeling laws let people put 15% of Mendocino fruit in their Sonoma County wine, and it was still Sonoma County wine. So a huge amount of Mendocino fruit just left in trucks after crush. And Anderson Valley was kind of the nice, rare exception in that the wine stayed here, but there weren't that many in-appellation producers, and there wasn't that much wine. Slowly, when the Dijon clones came in and some more money came in, the amount of producers outside the appellation tipped over and went to the majority. So in other words, there are more people labeling Anderson Valley Pinot Noir who are outside the valley than inside it. And at that point, it becomes very difficult to control your narrative because you've got 60 producers outside and 40 producers inside. Those are very rough numbers, don't hold me to them, but that's kind of the shape of it. So to get control of your story becomes even more important when your grapes are so good that everybody wants them, but a lot of everybody lives somewhere else. And as David pointed out, they don't care about your region that much. They're selling a wine for their brand. You know, if you're William Sellium, you're not selling a region. You're selling William Sellium. I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but that's their model. If you're Costa Brown, that's your model. You make an Anderson Valley Pinot Noir because you can't get left out, but you're not really controlling the narrative the way Anderson Valley wants it controlled.
So the thing that comes to my mind with so many out-of-appellation producers of Anderson Valley fruit is how do you make them part of the conversation that takes place within Anderson Valley? And I was talking to Sarah last night about due structure for the association that needs to be revisited so that out-of-appellation producers pay dues based on the grapes that they're using from Anderson Valley, not on all their production, in order to encourage them to be members, because it actually is really important for people producing particularly the best quality wines in places outside the appellation to be part of the in-appellation conversation. So things that can be done to encourage that, I think, are going to really help the appellation.
And part of it is getting that virtuous cycle going where the local
Yes.
collaboration is so strong that the out-of-appellation producers want to be part of that party.
Yeah.
They want to contribute to that story, and they want to tell it because it sells their wine. They're getting appellation equity from Anderson Valley they weren't getting before. We got to somehow seduce them into it, and then
Yep.
it goes up. So what else, David?
Can I talk about Chardonnay in the Willamette Valley?
Let's see a
This
show of
actually
hands. Can
is-
David talk about Chardonnay?
It's pertinent.
Yeah.
It's pertinent because of this. 15 years ago, the Willamette Valley was making really crappy Chardonnay.
It's true.
Well,
It's just true.
yeah, it's really true. We were sort of trying to imitate California style, whatever that means, but not doing a very good job of it. And the first thing that happened is we brought in the Dijon clones a little bit before that, but a couple of things happened after that. Dominique Lafont was hired by Evening Land, and they had a vineyard that was mostly Pinot, and the owners of Evening Land told him, well, here's the style of wine we want you to make, and here's when you'll pick it. And he said, well, there's Chardonnay out there. Oh, we don't care about that. We're going to take it out. I mean, if you want to do anything, it's whatever you want to do. Dominique Lafont knew a little bit about Chardonnay, and walked the vineyard and saw that there was one section that was somewhat different and kept that separate. And the short of the story is 2 years later, he got 97 points in the Wine Spectator for Willamette Valley Chardonnay. I don't know that anybody had gotten anywhere near that before. The next thing that happened was the 11 vintage, where Oregon was so late that many of us could go to Burgundy and do harvest in Burgundy and then come home and do harvest at home. We're actually looking at that again this year. So we're buying tickets soon. But a number of people really focused on Chardonnay producers. And my friend Josh Bergstrom was saying at Rouleau, he was watching the Chardonnay grapes come over the sorting table, and he couldn't believe how crappy they looked. How they were so unripe, he couldn't imagine how anybody was going to make white Burgundy that was at all reputable. But he came home and he tried picking much earlier than he used to, at 21 bricks or 20 and a half bricks, 3 OPH, and was astonished how good the wines were. And then the third thing that happened is a certain winery called Adelsheim Vineyard decided they wanted to focus only on Chardonnay and Pinot Noir. There was only one problem. We actually didn't have much Chardonnay planted, so we needed to figure out where to plant that Chardonnay. And we were kind of looking at months of going around cellar to cellar and trying out wines in one place and then the next and trying to make sense of where we should be planting. And then we came up with this idea, what if we just had everybody bring their wine to one place and we'd taste them all together? Not only would we figure out where we wanted to plant, but other people could figure out what they wanted. And so we had everybody fill out a big sheet. It had, I don't know, 50 or 100 different important points about where the grapes were grown, clones, rootstocks, AVA, soil, you know, everything except the winemaker name. And you had this next to the wine, and you walked around from table to table, and you could do the tasting in any order you decided. You could taste by AVA, by soil tape, by date of harvest, by sugar level at harvest, pH at harvest, clone. Just follow the list and pick those next wines. And everybody did that. Everybody that was making Chardonnay came to that first year. And the wines that year were kind of like this, all over the board. There was stuff that was overripe, over-oaked, under-oaked. Figure out a variable and it was over or under. 5 years later, they were like this. Everybody was stealing the best ideas that they were able to taste the year before and trying them out. And that is the true benefit of collaboration. We, in essence, without dictating or even attempting to create a style of wine, that's what we did. And I'm not going to bother you with the detail of that, but I wanted to ensure that you understood that the Willamette Valley now has a style for Chardonnay because we encourage collaboration and everybody jumped at the chance to taste everybody's Chardonnays one morning in April or May or whatever month it was, and then sit around and discuss them and try to figure out what they learned. I don't know that we have the perfect solution to how do you do that conversation, but just tasting everybody's wines and stealing the best ideas was pretty important.
Collaboration is an action, not something you talk about and then get drunk together over. So we'll look at as well at a little bit more history, if you don't mind, Thom, of Anderson Valley while you're finishing up, because maybe about a third of the room has gotten their responses in. So the other 2/3, you know your job.
So one of the challenges that we have in Anderson Valley is that we started white and became red rather late. When the appellation was officially applied for in 1982, 75% of the acreage was white grapes, and everybody knew what the red grape was, Zinfandel. Cabernet was tied with Pinot Noir for the other red grape. So just for perspective, in 1982, when Anderson Valley applied for the appellation, Napa Valley also applied, but in that same time frame, but they were already 10 years into a shift away from having multiple varieties to focusing on Cabernet, because Silver Oak had been founded and Justin Meyer and Bonnie had decided that they were going to do Cabernet and Cabernet only. And by 1982, when they opened their winery doors on release day, they had people lined up down Highway 29, and it took the entire day just to clear the people who came to the winery on release day. Within a few years after that, they were selling $1 million of wine on release day at retail because it was Cabernet only. When Napa had to replant due to phylloxera at the end of the 80s, early 90s, everybody planted Cabernet. So for the last 30 years, what is Napa Valley? It's Cabernet. We didn't get to have a moment like that. We had this kind of steady crawl forward to Pinot Noir that a lot of writers, trade, and media missed, frankly. So that's a challenge. We've got kind of a newish red wine story compared to an old red wine story. I can tell you, after 2000, 2002, 2003, when you would have thought Pinot Noir was completely established here, I was still getting assignments from magazines to compare Anderson Valley to Finger Lakes and Okanagan Valley. Why? Cold climate white wine region. They make some Pinot Noir, but it's not very good, is it? So I kind of moved away from that and started to do comprehensive tastings of Anderson Valley Pinot Noir with local winemakers. All the wines we could get in appellation, out of appellation, didn't matter. We rounded them up, we tasted them blind, we were systematic about it. And yeah, there were some rustic wines, but most of them were pretty darn good. And then I went looking at the coverage of Anderson Valley, and it was still about a rustic wine region with back-to-the-landers making the wine. Most of the back-to-the-land people had already hired professional young winemakers out of Davis and Fresno, or France by that point. But the story was still about rustic. You can go and find wine tasting notes now for Anderson Valley Pinot Noir costing well over $100 that uses wines like rusticity, wild, untamed. So that's another challenge for us. The wine's not rustic anymore, but the region looks rustic, and so people have said, that's the story, rustic. Who here wants a rustic Pinot Noir, right? These are not rustic wines, but that story has lingered. So that's one of the reasons that David's talking about collaboration. No one individually has felt the weight of that, but everyone collectively has felt the weight of it. Everyone is on a lower floor economically than they could be if we had the appellation equity that Willamette or Russian River or Lodi has, for example.
Well, what could change the game, I guess, if you don't mind speaking to that slide. And David might have some ideas on that, too.
Well, you got to decide to do it, right, David? You know, you have to decide that you want an identity, right? It doesn't happen, or someone else gives it to you.
Yeah, no, I mean, you can't slide into having an identity. You have to take possession of it. And it can only come by having a conversation by the industry about the next steps. How do you do it? What components are there of that? And certainly there is a social identity and there is a wine identity. And those are both valid identities to promote. Currently, if you're correct, the social identity is rustic people, and the wine identity is what? Rustic wine.
Our identity is David Adelsheim was never here before. That kind of sums it up in a nutshell. So I would say, first is the commitment. You can't slide into it. That's a great way to put it. And people thought we had an identity, and just so vague. The other thing is that David put his finger on it. The wine is not enough. Remember, we talked about a reputation is a wine plus regional factors. And the regional factors that we've had is redwood trees and buntling and cannabis and stuff like that. That doesn't help wine quality at all. It doesn't help our wine story at all. So what's the story about Anderson Valley? What is it about all these winemakers who are willing to go this far to make wine this good from a grape this hard? What's the story that's the combination of wine and place? So that has to be figured out, and then you have to tell that kind of relentlessly, right? I mean, Willamette Valley, remember the knock on Willamette Valley is that it rained too much? How did you guys beat that?
Did we beat it?
I was going to say the knock or the allure of the Willamette was how it's always cool, it never gets hot, and so we would all sweat our what's off when it was 112 degrees at the salmon roast every IPNC and go, yeah, cool climate, it's awesome.
It's cool sometimes at the end of the year. Yeah. No.
Yo, question.
Yeah, so I think there's a circular or tautological argument being made, and that is if the majority of wines from the Anderson Valley appellate wines are being made by great wineries outside the valley, doesn't that say that we already have a story? And so I want to ask the winemakers, who I've seen some in this room, what is it about the fruit here? What is it about the wine growing? I think Napa was way ahead of us in terms of farming. They started farming better 20, 30 years before we did. But what is it about the place that makes it attractive to come to remote Anderson Valley and spend 5 months?
Did everybody hear the question? You know, what is it about this fruit up here that makes so-called great wineries want to travel up here to buy the fruit? And as an outsider, I can think of one word: it's different. Now, the question is, can we define the difference?
There's no cell phone coverage here.
No cell phone coverage. Okay. Do I hear? Yes. Back. You guys want to answer that before we move to the next question, or are you wanting to answer the question too?
Not answering the question, but I think people come here because they bought from a Pinot Noir that have 3 dimensions, that have floral, fruit, earth, and there's not many places or many regions in the world where you can find those 3 dimensions in one. And I think there's a few terroirs here that have that, and I think that's why people come here.
Floral, fruit, and earthy. Any comment on the tautological circle that we've been making? Yes, of course.
Microclimate, macroclimate equals great grapes. That's it.
Soil, microclimate, macroclimate equals great
what
grapes.
about the
Well, when they're
mesoclimate?
all right, and when the right grape is there. Yeah, exactly.
Okay,
But
so
I come back to the issue is because what they can buy here is different than what they already have. Otherwise, they would not come here. So there's a difference.
So those of us who live here understand that there's a astonishing uniformity in the farming practices because only a few vineyard management companies control the viticulture. That's not common in other places as it is here. It's necessary here because we have housing shortage, labor shortage, and every other kind of shortage you could imagine, water. So we have to do it that way. And in some ways, that's a blessing because it's not wildcat vineyard practices. There's astonishing uniformity. So then the microclimate story kind of raises its head. Is it really true that every 100 meters or quarter mile the climate changes? Is that true here? And if that's true, could we ever have an Appalachian story that made sense?
David.
Yes, you can. I mean, every fall, I think it may even be January, there's an international terroir conference, and the last couple of years you could watch it online because that's where it was. And what was the most incredible thing to me is that nobody agreed on what things in the climate caused what things in the wine. There were all sorts of proposals and other things, but frankly, it's so disconnected that for me to study the mesoclimate of the vineyards and the macroclimate and all of that leads to confusion and every vineyard being its own thing. Let me tell you what we've done in Shayla Mountains. So I wrote the petition for the Willamette Valley in 1982. It was approved in 83. And for 20 years, that was great. And then in the areas in the north of the Willamette Valley where there were a lot of grapes planted, people wanted to really specify where their grapes were coming from within this thing that was 120 miles long. So we got to work, and there was a big committee, and we created, in that big committee, 6 different nested AVAs within the Willamette Valley, ensuring that they didn't overlap and that there weren't places where grapes were planted that weren't included. So that it was a little like how the French would do appellations that sort of made sense, at least within the framework of the TTB. Just as an aside, you know that the AVA system was created by the ATF in 1979 because the European Union threatened to prevent the sale of American wines with place names on them because there was no process. Wine said Napa Valley. What does that mean? Where is Napa Valley? How is it defined? There was nothing. So they set up the AVA process, and the AVA process does 2 things. It requires you to come up with the name that has a history and a tradition of that place, and to come up with a boundary. The word wine does not appear in the TTB regulation on AVAs. You can talk about wine all you want, but they don't care. They just want to know the name and the boundary.
And they do prefer roads as boundaries, highways, things like that.
No.
Often.
You can use a
Well,
mountain
I mean,
peak.
we used elevation lines, and they're perfectly happy with that.
Well, yeah, no, things improved. I
Yes.
was referring to the early days. You know, the very first AVA was Herman, Missouri, and if that didn't let you know that this is a politically, bounded idea, nothing did.
Yeah,
Napa was second.
yeah. But having said that, when we did the Shayla Mountains, we did that. We used the name from the 1820s, and we drew a line, and we were delighted when 4 years later the TTB approved it, and we told everybody that we finally got this AVA, and they said, great, but what do the wines taste like? What are they supposed to taste like? You're supposed to do that? We had no idea. We had 3 major different soil types. They didn't taste remotely alike. So now, what is it, 16 years later, we're finally doing the work that we should have done back then. We're putting together a series of tastings that's set up by a researcher at the University of Dijon who does these kinds of things, in which everybody will sit in a little cabin with 20 glasses in front of them that are arranged in a Roman square, which means everybody's seeing them in different order. And the job of every individual winemaker taster is to put the 20 wines into groups based on attributes that are attributable to place. Now, we haven't done this yet, but we're still trying to make this happen. Everything has to be a single vineyard, of course, because it doesn't make sense to put blends in with single vineyards. But the hope is that they won't choose the number 1 and put everything in one group, or the number 20 and put everything in its own group, but in fact will create 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 groups. And then their next assignment is to come up with a list of adjectives to describe each group and what makes it different than the other groups. And this is very different than using climate or soil or wind or rain or physical causations of the differences. This is looking at the result. And because the winemaking in the Willamette Valley and the grape growing is so similar, like you're talking about here for grape growing, we believe that, and we've done some sort of preliminary work and found 5 different neighborhoods. So our goal is to say the Shayla Mountains is actually 5 neighborhoods or 6 neighborhoods or whatever the number is. These are the attributes of each neighborhood. These are what you can expect when you get a Pinot Noir from that neighborhood.
This is what you will taste in your mouth.
So,
And one other thing.
yes.
this is what the tasting room associate is saying about the wines in that neighborhood. They're not making it up on the spot or using glowing language, but nothing specific. They will be part of this so that they're underlining these specific descriptors for the different neighborhoods.
The stable relationship based on wine and regional factors. That's what we're trying
Did
to do
you
today.
write that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Excellent. So once again, please make sure that you've gotten in all your scores. We need to go through the wines real quickly and certainly find out